had a lot of time to think about this podcast and kind of what we're doing with this podcast. I've had over a year. It's been a year in the making, but I've been thinking, what if I thought about one story about my life, how would I sum that story up? How would I sum my life up and who I am with one singular story? And I'm going to rewind a little bit and kind of give you an idea of what happened. So I was about 4 to 5 years old. I'm going to say 4 because if I was 5 and I did something like this and my dad didn't kill me, kudos to Pops. So we lived at a ranch, in the house, the ranch house that was there. My dad, helped the farmer work the land. Just kind of grew up in a very humble setting. Don't really remember much about being poor, because I always had such richness with my family. But most people would classify the way that we lived back then as poor. Now, if you want to look, take it back even further, my grandparents had it really poor. My grandpa remembers his favorite food being garlic because that's all they had. So if that's all they had, that's all he could eat. Now, my grandma, my mom's mom, was born and raised in a chicken coop with her family. Her first memory of her mom was her mom in a casket. So from a young age, my grandma had it rough. Growing up in a pigeon coop, so, I had this conversation with my mom the other night. We're in the pool, and I'm like, I say we're poor, and she takes that like it's some big, like we weren't poor. And then I look at how my mom grew up. And during the summer, she's working the fields. So there's a lot of stuff when I look back to this one house, it brings up a lot of memories. But they were memories of nothing I really ever knew. I didn't know what being poor was. That's all I knew. I knew that I had my family. I had my mom. I had my dad. I had my bully older brother. But this particular story is something that when you want to know the essence of who I really am, on all levels, you can look at this one story. So I grew up, one of the first things I remember is my dad had a motorcycle. My dad loved this motorcycle. I think he had it when he was maybe 19. He bought a motorcycle. And he tore this bike apart and he put it back together. And he put it back together with the money that he had and the resources that he had. He put this motorcycle together. Now, Big Mark, after he put the bike together, he was excited. So, he had all the parts painted. It was looking nice. He put it all back together and was sitting on crates. And my dad worked really hard. Has always worked really hard. So he goes in to take a nap. And like I said, I'm going to say little 4-year-old Sean, because there was a time before that I tried to light the house on fire. She was hanging out of the wall, and I had a lighter. Who gives a kid a lighter? I don't know if they gave it to me, if I just found it, but how I was able to make fire at such a young age is pretty impressive. But I walked to that wall, and I just went like that, and I lit the fire, and I just backed up. I took like 4 or 5 steps back, and I just was going to watch the house burn down. And I had no clue what was going on, but I thought it was beautiful. Fire to me was just so amazing. I don't know how Big Mark thought about it, but he came outside and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, what are you doing? So he put out the fire. So, good thing about my dad, whenever there was something huge that I did, it never really was a thing. He knew that I knew I messed up by him just telling me. That was bad. Now, me having the ADHD that I do, I constantly needed behavior modification. Throughout, I can remember in junior high, I was just like, I found out how to hide it. But when you have severe ADHD, which we'll talk about later in the podcast, that's a very debilitating disease. Okay? So there was constant behavior modification in my household. But stuff that was big, for some reason, Big Mark had an amazing ability to let that stuff slide. So, let me get back into this story about the essence of who I am. So, I walk out one day into the garage, and there I see this beautiful black motorcycle. And again, I was a fan of motorcycles. But I saw such beauty in this motorcycle that my dad had put together with his bare hands that I watched him. And I helped him get as much as I could at the age that I was. And it was beautiful. So, in my little mind, I was like, how could I make something as visually beautiful as that motorcycle that happen to be painted fresh black. How do I make it even better? So you know what I did? I walked over to the flower beds. And in the flower beds, I don't know, depending on your age, you'd probably see them a lot more back then. When we were younger, I'm 38. But those little white rocks that were a little tiny, about the size of a pea. And there was a massive quantity of rocks in the flower beds. So I decide to add pure visual beauty with pure sound beauty. And I said, I'm the maestro of this musical, baby. So I went over to the ground and I grabbed a handful of rocks and threw them at the motorcycle. And all over the metal, all over the fresh paint on the tank. And you know what I did? I grabbed another handful. And again, boom! And I'm out here having the best time of my life. I see this beautiful motorcycle. I got an endless supply of white rocks. And I'm picking them up and I'm throwing handfuls at my dad's motorcycle. Now, I don't know if Pops was asleep. I don't know what was going on. But I could only imagine my dad putting all those hours and days into that motorcycle and a fresh paint job, and he was getting ready to ride his motorcycle because I got one. I got me a nice Harley Davidson 2018 Road Glide that unfortunately I got my friends' kids always putting their hands on it, writing on it and stuff, but I'm not that kind of guy. I'm the kind of guy that grabs handfuls of rocks and throws them at freshly painted motorcycles, so how could I ever get mad at a kid who comes into my house and wants to scratch dust into my motorcycle? I can't. So imagine this. And my dad, mind you, is a big dude. In his prime, he was 6'3", about 296. Okay, I don't exaggerate numbers. That's the biggest he was. At this time, he wasn't that big because he was only probably about 23 years old, 24 years old. But he's hearing something. And if you can only imagine, when you hear a sound that you don't hear often, and trust me, the sound of rocks, those little rocks hitting a motorcycle, is a sound that he's never heard before. I promise you that. So I can only imagine Big Mark inside just listening. Like, what is that sound? And it keeps happening. And it keeps happening. So sooner or later, Big Mark had to go investigate what was happening. And imagine, okay, you have a 4-year-old son that's already tried to light your house on fire, okay? And you walk out, and in his little red hand is a handful of white rocks, and he's getting ready to throw it at your motorcycle for the umpteenth time. And I sit there, and I look at my dad, and I was just like, that was beautiful. Visual beauty, sound beauty. And that was still to this day, although it was one of the worst things in the memory I remember from when I was little, that is by far one of the best memories I have ever had. And it wasn't about the fact that I ruined my dad's masterpiece. It's the fact that I was able to participate in his masterpiece with my own masterpiece. So when people want to look at what this podcast is, what it's going to be about, I'm raw, unfiltered. I will try to mind my tongue, but I will tell you what, I don't care if it's my mom, if it's my dad, I don't care if it's my wife, my kids. I'm going to tell it 100% honest and original, as good as I can tell it, because that's all I know. What we're creating right now is beauty. It's the beauty of the spirit, of the soul, and we're sharing this. And we're going to be sharing it the whole time. We're going to be talking about real life events, things that happen in my life. I feel like I was put here for a purpose. I taught for 13 years. I finished my last 9 years in a continuation school, and I always felt like there was something bigger for me. I needed to reach more people. And it's taken me a long time to get to this point. Now, I was at a restaurant, this is probably about 2.5 years ago, where my best friend Brandon, one of my best friends, he calls me. Anytime you want to get me somewhere, be like, hey, Sean, let's go to lunch. I got you. And I'm there. But if you want to go to coffee, I got you. So you're there. So anyways, he calls me out to lunch one time. And I thought he was calling me to just like check on me. Because I've been dealing with PTSD. I was going through really bad depression. So I'm thinking this dude's calling to be just like, hey man, like here we are. Been best buds for a long time. Let's talk. And he starts talking all right. And in the middle of all this, he tells me, he goes, hey, I know what your problem is. And I'm like, yeah, dude, things are pretty messed up right now, bro. He goes, nah, that might be part of it, but I know what your bigger problem is. He says, you're afraid of your own greatness. And talk about a backhanded compliment. I'm a king of them, so I know what it feels like. And this is what he gave me. This is what he told me. You brought me to Pismo's to tell me this, dog? You brought me to a crowded place, Jerry Maguire-esque, mob-esque. Like, you brought me to a crowded place so you could tell me something of this nature and I can't react? All right, that's a pretty good sneak attack. But it opened an eye. It opened my eye to my past. And I look at everything in my past that I've always done, not necessarily out of fear of my own greatness, but because I've always marched to the beat of my own drum. And maybe greatness is something I've never wanted. Maybe it's something I was never ready for. But I wake up every day at 3:45. I pray. I meditate. I get ready for the world. And right now I'm beginning to see that maybe my purpose in life is beyond myself, is beyond my small greatness. And it's not about me, because I've never cared about me. I've never cared about money, because I've never had money. I never cared about anything but my relationships with people. And now I know that my relationship with God has enabled me to create such stronger relationships with people. And when I look back to that 4-year-old that had rocks in his hands without a care in the world, after all these years, from that moment to up until recently, after all these years, I never had that again. I've lived in fear. I've lived in panic. I've lived with depression. I lived with so little peace and presence in my life that I would never have dreamed to grab a handful of rocks and just throw them at that motorcycle. But I'm at a point now, I got that little kid back, and I'm ready to share my story. So when you see me grabbing a handful of rocks, and what you think is I'm throwing them at that beautiful motorcycle, just know that I'm making beautiful sound. And by that sound, I'm trying to get you and everyone else that listens to this podcast to understand one thing, that my heart will always be in the right position. I will always be coming from a place of love, of empathy, of caring. And just because I represent both sides doesn't mean that we can't come together on a common message with a common goal of making this world a better place. So as we go forward and we walk into the light, I welcome you to join me on my journey. Much love.